This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, the political crisis in Nicaragua is intensifying. More than 178 people have been killed since widespread demonstrations to oust Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega began in mid-April, when his government announced plans to overhaul and slash Social Security. Amnesty International has accused the Nicaraguan government of using, quote, pro-government armed groups to carry out attacks, incite violence, increase their capacity for repression, and operate outside the law. On Monday, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zeid Ra'ad al-Hussein, condemned the recent outbreak of violence in Nicaragua.
In Nicaragua, anti-government protests over the past 2 months have led to the killing of at least 178 people, almost entirely at the hand of the police forces and by armed pro-government groups.
But the Nicaraguan government has blamed part of the violence on armed members of the opposition who are trying to overthrow the democratically elected President Ortega. Much of the Nicaragua is at a standstill as opposition groups have set up barricades along key roads, many guarded by masked men armed with homemade mortars. On Monday, opposition groups in Nicaragua's third largest city, Masaya, declared independence from Ortega's government. According to the Washington Post, the opposition formed a 5-member junta of National Salvation to run the city, which was once seen as a Sandinista stronghold.
Efforts to hold a national dialogue between the government and civil society appears to be falling apart. On Monday, key parts of the opposition, including leaders of the student protests, pulled out of the talks, at least temporarily. Meanwhile, some of the student groups have sought assistance from the Trump administration, marking the biggest crisis since Daniel Ortega was elected 11 years ago. Ortega served as president of Nicaragua since 2007. In the late 70s, as leader of the Sandinista National Liberation Front, he helped overthrow the U.S.-backed Nicaraguan dictator Anastasio Somoza. We're joined here in New York by Paul Oquist. He is a senior minister for national policy in the Nicaraguan government. Can you talk? We had a previous show where we had a number of people, former Sandinistas, deeply concerned about what's happening, the killing of over 100 protesters in Nicaragua. Your thoughts?
Nicaragua is a polarized society, and there's been violence in the last 2 months on both sides. And what we've seen lately is a wave of violence never seen before in Nicaragua, of kidnappings, of state institutions destroyed, mayor's offices burned down, torture, intimidation, persecution. And there's been a tremendous slant in the news because this is a media war also, and it's a social media war. It's straight out of Gene Sharp's handbook of how to destabilize governments that's been used several times. And I'm not the only one saying this. Gene Sharp's handbook has been recommended by leaders of this movement. You can find that on the internet. And false news, black propaganda is part of the game. And there's no balance in this. It's all one-sided. So the media here and in Europe and elsewhere pick up verbatim the statements that come from the movement. And contrary information somehow is filtered out. For example, on the 16th of June, Francisco Arauz Pineda, who is working to remove barricades, these barricades are not civic, peaceful events. They're coerced. They're violently enforced. And he and another gentleman were killed. And Francisco Arauz Pineda's body, after he was shot and on the street, and you can find a video of this on the internet also, was burnt. They threw gasoline on him and burned his body, and then they put a Sandinista flag on it, and they were joking about it, and really not respecting his corpse at all. They were having a little party around his corpse. So these things are not reported. There's no balance. What the government is looking for now is to get out of this cycle of violence, to get back to peace. Nicaragua lived in peace for 11 years. They were the government of national reconciliation and national unity was formed by overcoming the conflicts of the 80s, which was the inclusion of the resistance in the government and of Yatama that had also been part of the armed movement supported by the CIA in the 1980s. Now we need to get out of this cycle of violence, and by the same way, through negotiations, through dialogue. That's what happened in the 80s at Sapua. The government met with the Contra, and the peace agreement started to be hammered out, and the Esquipulas process led to the elections of 1990. Nicaragua is a polarized society. You will not get peace by having one side trying to impose on the other side. If the violent overthrow of the government position, the que se vaya ya position, has a tremendous flaw. It hasn't been thought through. The violence will continue. The violence will continue because one side cannot impose upon the other side. We need a negotiated settlement, and the government is trying to promote that.
Well, I wanted to ask you, when you say the society is polarized, who is the opposition from your perspective? I mean, because obviously there are ex-Sandinistas who have been critical of President Ortega for basically removing anyone who might be critical of him, and who have joined the opposition. So who is leading the opposition?
That group, which is very exaggerated in the media, is a very small minority. Mm-hmm. In the opinion polls, they poll 1%, the MRS, 1%. And as a matter of fact, that's an obstacle. You had people on this very show saying that they want the violent overthrow of the government, and they want it now. There's a plan already in place to get elections next year. The OAS and Nicaragua have signed a plan which will lead, and there's a calendar for it that's being executed as we speak, to a reform of the National Electoral Council and the electoral law and the electoral rolls by January of next year. But that can't happen unless there's peace. As a matter of fact, we're seeing that the dialogue is very difficult with this violence, with the barricades that are impeding the free movement of people and goods, which are making the life very difficult. Farmers can't get their crops to the market, they're losing money. The people who can't get to work, the people who work and earn a salary every day are in very bad straits. The tourism industry has been brought to a halt, and all the tourist workers, a great many of them,
I want to play a clip
of
the human rights activist Monica Lopez Boltodano in Managua speaking about the demonstrations in Nicaragua and what the protesters are demanding.
What we have been seeing for the past 45 days is the rise up of a very strong popular rebellion against the violence of Daniel Ortega's government. The rebellion has been led by youth, mostly kids in the youth in the universities, but also it's now become a rebellion of all Nicaraguan population. We have seen massive protests on the streets, and also important actions of protest that are happening. For instance, more than 70% of the roads in Nicaragua are blocked by population that is requesting two basic things: justice for the more than 127 people that have been murdered by Ortega's regime so far, and more than 1,000 people injured, and also the decision of Nicaraguan population that Ortega and his wife leaves power.
So that's Monica Lopez Boltodano, one of the leading protesters.
Did Daniel Ortega and Rosario Murillo leave power? Because Monica Boltodano says it, because there's barricades on the streets. There's a thing called democratic process.
Let me just
what we're looking for is a democratic process. We're looking for peaceful conditions that can lead to democratic outcomes. It's not, advocate a coup, a violent coup, in a polarized society does not end the violence. The violence would continue. We need institutions. We need democracy now.
Why did the Ortega government open fire on the protesters? More than 100 have been killed.
They're not all. That is a very gross exaggeration.
What would you say?
But they say this.
What do you say?
I say that the government has agreed that the forensic people of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights accompany the Nicaraguan prosecutors in elucidating each and every one of those cases without gross generalizations, which one hears every day, trying to put the 10 policemen who've been killed on the account of the government, that the government burned down its own mayor's offices in various cities, that the X on the houses of the Sandinistas,
we have
which
20 seconds,
terror.
but we will do a post-show.
No,
but for right now,
there is.
What are you calling for?
Absolute bias in the media internationally, picking up on this media war by taking the black propaganda and presenting it as fact. There's no balance. What we need is balance. What we need is to dialogue, to get to a peace process which can lead to elections, and the Nicaraguan people decide, not Monica Baltodano and 71 barricades.
We'll leave it there, but continue this discussion and put it online at democracynow.org. Paul Oquist, Senior Minister for National Policy in President Daniel Ortega's government. That is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Special thanks to Mike Burke, Renee Feltz, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Laura Gottesdiener. Thanks for joining us.